Object-oriented programming, or OOPS. We are taking question and answer on it. What do you understand by OOP, or Object-Oriented Paradigm? So this OOP, or Object-Oriented Programming or Paradigm, this is the full form. So there are various languages, programming languages, which follow this object-oriented paradigm. So these programming languages are called object-oriented programming. So this is a programming paradigm, and that revolves around, that has a pointer, and that pointer is called object. That is, the base is object, not the function, not the procedure, not the methods. The previous structural programming languages, the functional programming languages, all these were basically revolves around the function or procedure. But here, everything is around object. That is why it is object oriented. So everything will be on the basis of object. Basically, the main idea is that real life entity, a real life world has to be mimicked, has to be actually programmed. So object is a real world entity that will contain the data and the code and the functions operating on that code. So this allows binding data and code together. So we have certain concepts and certain baseline concepts which defines an object-oriented programming. The basic is that everything has to be an object. For example, Java, it is not a pure object-oriented paradigm following language because everything is not an object. So OOPS, or object-oriented programming, is based on four main concepts. The first is abstraction. The second one is polymorphism. Third one is encapsulation. And fourth one is inheritance. In any order you can just remember it. So abstraction is all about creating abstract classes, abstract methods, the interfaces. That is, in certain programming languages there are interfaces, somewhere it is not. Basically what you're doing here is you are creating a class, abstract methods or abstraction you are given, just have to implement. That is, you're not giving the implementation here. Similarly, we are talking about the encapsulation. Whenever we are making a class, what does it mean? It acts like a capsule. In this capsule, we are fitting the variables or the data, or we are filling the functions. This function will be operating on these variables. Along with this, we have the access modifiers, which are default, public, private, protected. Then coming to the polymorphism. Polymorphism can be compile time and runtime. That is one phase doing different acting. For example, a function add can act differently depending upon what kind of input you are giving or what kind of return type it is having. So it can be compile time. When it is at compile time, that is called as method overloading, and when it is at runtime, it is called method overriding. So compile time, method overloading, runtime, method overriding. Then we have the inheritance. As I was saying that the real world entity, you inherit something from your father like money, like land or house. So same way, a class, when it is being made, the content can be reused, reusability. So you just have to inherit that class. So the class which is inheriting is called the base class. The above class which is being inherited is called the superclass sometime, or the parent class. So parent child concept is there. There are different types of inheritance. We have single, multi-level. So this is basically mimicking, all these are mimicking the real world, and that can only be possible with objects. Name any 7 widely used object-oriented programming languages. So the mostly what we are using today is Python and C#, but after C there was all object-oriented programming language. So C++ got very famous. Most of the software still are written in C++, variations of C++, C++11, C++14, like that. So let me name it. Python, Java, Go, Dart, C++, C Sharp, Ruby. So C Sharp related to Microsoft. What is the purpose of using OOPS concepts, object-oriented programming concepts? Why are we using it? Why we are not using other kinds of concepts of programming? So the idea and the aim of OOPS is to implement real world entities, because you are programming for real world. So you need certain kind of concepts. For example, your father is there and you inherit something from him. This is the real life scenario. So in object oriented programming, we can implement it using inheritance. Okay. In structured languages, we have global data and local data and statics data. But here we have the data which is, we can hide them. We don't expose them. We only expose when it is required. A single function can have different faces, polymorphism. So inheritance, hiding, polymorphism, these are the basic building blocks of the object-oriented programming, which is actually mimicking and implementing the real world entities. The main purpose of OOP is these data and function. So the function can work on these data which is being defined in a class. So the other part is not accessible, they are not been exposed to others. For example, if you in structured programming language, you just write main and then you write everything there. You just call the functions. So basically, these the problems which were there in the structural programming languages or the previous programming language, they are tried to be handled in object-oriented programming paradigm concepts. So we have the abstraction. Abstraction is all about creating those classes which cannot be instantiated. It needs to be implemented. Interface also implemented. Then we have the polymorphism. Polymorphism can be, you can overload and override the methods. It can be at compile time, runtime. Then have encapsulation is all about having the data function inside, and we have the class or interface. Inside this we have modifiers, and then inheritance, of course, the parent child concept. So now you can make a vehicle, and now you can make a vehicle and then inherit the car, any kind of Ford or say Chevrolet, etc. And these four things are the basic building blocks. Along with this, you have class and the object. These are very important because class is the main key, main frame whose everything comes to or is given to an object, and an object can do everything which a class has been made for. So that is why we are using OOPS. What are the four main features of object-oriented programming? So the four main features are inheritance, encapsulation, polymorphism, and data abstraction. So these four are very important, and every programming languages which is object oriented should treat everything as an object and should implement the inheritance, encapsulation, polymorphism, and all the code constructs which is given in the programming languages. They are made so that all these concepts can be implemented by a user. Why object-oriented programming is so popular? What is the reason? See, first thing, there is a real world. Now you are making software or program for real world. You are making a website. You are making a mobile application. For whom you are making? You are making for the real people. So there has to be some programming languages to implement the real world scenario. Somebody came to you, he says, make a mobile application for me. So you have to choose a programming language that should implement and provide you all the facilities so that you can make that real life mobile app work. So this real world scenario can only be implemented when you have the underlying constructs and concepts in a programming language, and that is possible in object-oriented programming, object-oriented paradigm. So this OOPS, this is considered as a good or better style of programming. The advantages are quite high than the disadvantages. Not only it helps in writing a complex piece of code quite easily, but also it allows user to handle and maintain them easily as well. So first is complexity is reduced, and maintaining and handling is also easy. Data abstraction, encapsulation, inheritance, polymorphism, all are there. They make it easy for programmers to solve the complex real-life scenarios or problems. That is why this OOPS or paradigm or this concept is so popular. Okay, now there are certain things which you need to know. This is following a bottom-up approach. The structural programming languages, they were following the top-down. That is, you have to make a main and then you decide what all functions you have to make. You start from the top and then you come to the bottom. Then you implement these functions. But in object-oriented programming, first you have to plan. Then you have to make the different classes. In this you have data variable, the function working on it. And then you combine these classes to make the whole software or project work. So all the previous programming languages, they were concentrating only on functions. Only on functions, as you see here. Add function, call, and just you make an add function and call it. Subtract, write somewhere, call it. So this was all about functions. There was no thought about data. Object-oriented programming is all about data. In the previous programming language, local data, global data, every data was not even thought of. The data is so important. You are working on data, so you are actually you have to be very careful about the data. But here, the data is the key. We are not. The functions are helping hands to operate on these data. So data is used by associated function within the class. That is, you make a class. First, you decide about the data, and then the function which are going to operate, that is going to work on this data. The security of this language, because you cannot access anything from anywhere. There are public, private, protected constructs, or you can say the access modifiers, specifiers. You have abstraction here. So the security is quite good in terms of data. So we have example like C++, Java, Visual Basic, Python, PHP. These are all popular object-oriented programming languages. What are the advantages and disadvantages of object-oriented programming? Well, there are mostly the advantages, less disadvantages. First thing is, it is a bottom-up approach. It is not following the top-down as the structural programming. The bottom-up approach, that is, you have to first design, first you have to plan what all things have to be done. So then you combine these. That is, you are actually thinking about the lower level of abstraction going to higher level of abstraction. The OOPS, it is modeling the real world well. You have polymorphism, inheritance, encapsulation, data abstraction. All these are because these are the constructs, these are the concepts which are there for real world. And since we have this inheritance, what do you write in a class? No, you have the reusability aspect. In inheritance, you can reuse it. So the public-private, I was just about telling that. This is to provide the abstraction. Data cannot be exposed everywhere. So object-oriented programming forces the designers, the software designers, to have a long and extensive design phase that result in better design and lower faults or fewer faults. That is, the most of the time is taken in design. If you make a good object-oriented related design, then only you can make a very good real-world life problem solution, and that will be in C++ or Java or PHP, etc. So we decompose a complex problem into smaller problem and then we deal with it. And programmers are able to reach their goals faster. The complexity is less because everything is quite clean and defined. Easy redesign and extension of code that do not affect the other functionality. For example, at the maintenance phase, some changes there. You know that this class and this function is there. What is the cohesion, what is the coupling, and you know it and you can change it. The disadvantages of OOPS, first of all, proper planning is required, proper design is required. You cannot jump to directly programming as you were doing in C language. Program design is quite tricky. You need good designers, understanding of UML, Unified Modeling Language, and the object-oriented programming constructs. Programming should be well skilled. Programmers should be well skilled because you need to know all the programming object-oriented concept. Then only you will be able to do it. And classes tend to be overly generalized. And overly generalized means number of classes, cohesion, coupling, all. There are certain scenarios which are quite cumbersome, and that has been taken care in other languages. What are the limitations of object-oriented programming languages? So there are advantages, so there are disadvantages also. So what are the basic disadvantages? First, in order to write a C++ program or a Java program, you have to do a proper planning. I'm not talking about a Fibonacci or a factorial program. I'm talking about the actual software made in these programming language. Program design is quite tricky and programmer has to be quite skilled, not only in making smaller programs, but the bigger programs, making classes, the objects which is going to instantiate how to make abstract classes, how to perform the overloadings and the runtime and the compile time, method overloading, overriding, etc. The classes tend to be overly generalized. So this generalization of classes all these are a complex thing. So let me talk to this again. It requires intensive testing processes because if the design is so that and you're making a real classes and they are combining, their cohesion coupling is there, intensive testing will be there. Solving problems that take more time as comparable to the procedural oriented programming, because procedural you just go on and make the functions or whatever you want to write, but here not. The size of the program will eventually be higher as compared to using the procedure oriented or structured programming language. The line of code or kiloline of code will be higher. Software developed using this approach, it requires a substantial, significant amount of designing, pre-work, planning, analysis, etc. So if you do not have the class documentation, object-oriented programming code is somewhat difficult to understand. If you are not experienced, it may create problem. In certain scenarios, the program may consume large amount of the memory, and for small programs, OOPS is a no-no. Takes more time to solve problems. For example, C is a faster language, still the embedded software are written in C till now. But C++ takes more time than that. What are the differences between object-oriented programming and structural programming? The structural programming is all about functions. If you have worked on C, it's all about functions. If you have worked on C++, Java, it's all about the data. Okay. First of all, object-oriented programming and structural programming. Structural programming follows the top-down approach. That is, first you decide the main functionality, then you see, okay, what all small things we need. You make different functions for that. Object-oriented programming is a bottom-up. First you decide what you have to do at a lower level, like you make classes and then you combine them, collaborate them, interface them. The object-oriented programming, it provides you data hiding. You have private, protected, different access and access modifiers and specifiers. In structured programming, data hiding is not there. The least you can do is to make global and local. This is what you can do, or static for at the most. But in object-oriented programming, you have data hiding. In object-oriented, we have the solution to the complex problems, because it is mimicking, it is implementing the real world scenario. Structural programming, moderate to easier kind of problems can be solved. Structural programming, complex structural programming is not good. See, object oriented programming is giving you inheritance, and there are other all concepts. So it allows reusability of code, that reduces the redundancy of code. You don't have to write again and again. Make a class or make a component and you can just use it again and again. Reusability is good, or it provides the object oriented OOPS provides it. Structural, no. Reusability, you have to write it again and again. In OOPS, it is based on objects. The basic is object. A class you make and then you create as many objects you want. So it is based on objects rather than functions or procedure. Structural programming, it provides a logical structure to a program in which the program is divided into functions. Or you can just say that the structural programming is revolving around only the functions, procedures, or the method. It has no concern about object or the data, because there is no concept of object there. In OOPS, it provides more security as it has data hiding feature, as I just suggested. Data hiding is there. In structural programming, no data hiding. Everything is exposed. The data is exposed. Anyone can use it. Any class, any different file can use it. So object-oriented programming, data-oriented, structural programming, function-oriented. So first we write the data, then we write the function who are going to work on it, who are going to actually implement or interact with this data. In structural, it is on the functions. Data has no concern. Function is basis. What do you understand by pure object-oriented language? Why Java is not a pure object-oriented programming language? So in order to answer this question, the one thing is, any programming language which deals only with objects, that is pure. Otherwise, it is impure. So a programming language is called pure object-oriented language that treats everything inside the program as an object. There cannot be any kind of, say, predefined data type or user-defined data types. Everything has to be an object. So the primitive types are not supported by pure object-oriented programming languages. No primitive, no predefined. Okay. So there are some other features that must be satisfied by a pure object-oriented language. Of course, every programming language has to do. There are certain programming languages which are just 90 or 95% object-oriented, but we can deal with them. But for example, the PHP or Python, you can say that they hold that OOPS power. In encapsulation, inheritance, polymorphism, abstraction, these are there, but all predefined types are objects, all user-defined types are objects, all operation performed on object must be only through objects exposed to the objects. Methods which are objects exposed only by the objects. Java is not a pure object-oriented programming language because predefined data types in Java are not treated as objects. Therefore, it is not an object-oriented language. Now you have to tell me what all languages are not pure object-oriented language and which are impure, which are pure. What do you understand by class and object? This we are going to see in next discussion. Till then, thank you so much. Take care of yourself.